Blood soaked through the bandage on Ethan Cole's shoulder as he pushed open the iron gates of the Draven estate with the last of his strength. Behind him, smoke still rose from the valley, where his unit had been torn apart in less than 10 minutes. He did not know how he had survived. He only knew that his legs refused to stop moving, even now, even here, at the edge of a place he had heard whispered about since childhood, a place ruled by a family that was not entirely human. The guards at the gate raised their spears the moment they saw him. A lone soldier, filthy, bleeding, his uniform torn at the collar, was not a common sight at the Draven estate. One guard shouted for him to state his purpose. Ethan could barely form the words. He said only one thing before his knees buckled beneath him. "I need help." The guards exchanged a look of disgust rather than concern. Humans who wandered onto Draven land were usually turned away, sometimes worse. But something about the state of him, the way his hand trembled as he reached toward the gate, the emptiness in his eyes that spoke of horrors just witnessed, made one of the younger guards hesitate. He called for the household steward instead of driving Ethan off immediately. By the time Serafina Draven stepped out onto the front steps of the estate, drawn by the commotion, Ethan was on his knees in the courtyard, held upright only by the guard who had decided not to turn him away. Serafina was the only daughter of the Draven line, young, sharp-tongued, and used to a world that bent to her family's will. She looked down at the soldier the way one might look at something that had tracked mud across a clean floor. "What is this?" she asked, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "A soldier, my lady," the steward answered. "Human." He collapsed at the gate. Serafina descended the steps slowly, her silk robes trailing behind her, and circled Ethan the way a predator might study something wounded and uncertain if it was worth the trouble of finishing off. Ethan lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes. He did not look away, even in his state, and something about that small act of defiance irritated her more than anything else could have.
"Humans do not simply wander onto Dravenland and expect mercy," she said.
"Do you know where you are, soldier?" "I know," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "I did not choose this place. It chose me, when there was nowhere else to run." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the guards at his boldness, quickly silenced by a glance from Serafina. She knelt slightly, tilting her head, studying the blood soaking through his sleeve, the exhaustion carved into his face, the stubborn set of his jaw that refused to break even now. "You're bleeding onto my courtyard," she said. "That's going to need to be cleaned. And so will you, before you offend anyone else with your appearance." It was not kindness in her voice. It was closer to the tone one might use when deciding whether an animal was worth feeding. But she did not order him removed. Instead, she rose, brushed invisible dust from her robes, and addressed the steward without looking at Ethan again. "Have the healers look at him. I won't have a dying human staining the stones in front of guests. Once he's stable, put him to work somewhere he won't be seen. Kitchens, perhaps. Somewhere his presence won't be an insult to the household." Ethan was too weak to respond, but he heard every word. He filed it away, the way a soldier files away the position of an enemy sentry, not with anger, but with quiet, patient awareness. He was carried inside by two servants, past halls lined with portraits of Draven ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow him with the same disdain Serafina had shown. The healers worked on him through the night, murmuring in low voices about the depth of his wounds, the sheer luck it must have taken for him to survive an attack that had clearly killed everyone around him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation. At one point, he thought he heard someone say his survival shouldn't have been possible, and that the wound pattern on his shoulder didn't match anything a normal blade could cause. He was too tired to make sense of it. Sleep took him before he could ask a single question. When Ethan woke the next morning, sunlight was pouring through a narrow window into a small servant's room, spare but clean. His shoulder throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped, and someone had dressed the wound properly. He sat up slowly, testing his strength, and found a folded set of plain clothes at the foot of the bed, along with a pair of worn boots that were, at least, his size. A young servant girl entered without knocking, carrying a tray of food. She startled slightly upon finding him awake, then set the tray down and studied him with open curiosity. "You're the soldier," she said, "the one from the gate." "That's me," Ethan replied, offering a small, tired smile. Ethan Cole. I'm Lily. I work in the kitchens. Lady Serafina said you'd be joining us there, once you're able to stand without falling over. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this new reality without complaint. A day ago, he had commanded a unit of soldiers, men and women who trusted him with their lives. Now he was being assigned to peel vegetables in a kitchen belonging to a family that viewed him as barely worth the food they were feeding him. He could have let bitterness take root. Instead, he simply asked Lily where the kitchens were, and whether they needed help starting that very morning. Lily blinked, clearly not expecting eagerness. You should rest another day at least. I've rested enough, Ethan said, already reaching for the folded clothes. Lying still doesn't suit me. Word of the soldier's quick recovery spread through the servant quarters faster than expected, mostly because of how unusual his attitude was. Humans who found themselves at the mercy of the Draven family typically arrived either broken in spirit or desperate to prove their worth through flattery and groveling. Ethan did neither. He worked the kitchen tasks assigned to him with quiet efficiency, spoke little unless spoken to, and treated every servant, no matter their rank in the household hierarchy, with the same even respect. It did not take long for Serafina to notice him again, though she told herself it was only because his presence in her home was, admittedly, hard to ignore. She passed through the kitchen corridor on her way to the gardens one afternoon and found him stacking crates near the pantry door, his sleeves rolled up, his movements precise and economical, like a man who had spent his life training his body to waste no motion. Still here, she said, more statement than question, stopping in the doorway. Ethan set down the crate he was holding and turned to face her, unbothered by the interruption. Where else would I be? I assumed you would have run off by now. Humans usually do, once they realize what it means to serve this house. I'm not running from anything, Ethan said simply. I've done enough running for one lifetime. Something about the flatness of his tone, the complete absence of fear or flattery, needled at Serafina in a way she couldn't quite name. She was used to humans who trembled in her presence, who bowed too low and spoke too fast, desperate for her favor. Ethan did none of that. He simply looked at her, calm and unreadable, as though she were no more remarkable than the crates stacked beside him. You should be more careful with that tone, she said, stepping further into the kitchen, her voice sharpening. You're a guest in this house, only because my mother's healers wasted their time on you. Don't mistake survival for belonging. I haven't mistaken anything, Ethan replied. I know exactly where I stand. His words were not defiant, not angry, simply honest, and that honesty unsettled her more than any argument could have. She opened her mouth to say something cutting, something that would put him back in his place, but the words didn't come as easily as they usually did. Instead, she found herself studying him for a moment too long, taking in the calm intelligence behind his eyes, the way he held himself even in servant's clothes, like a man who had commanded others and never quite lost that bearing. See that you remember it, she finally said, turning on her heel and leaving, without waiting for a response, annoyed at herself for not having the last word the way she usually did. Ethan watched her go, then returned to his work, without another thought on the matter. He did not know, not yet, that his arrival at the Draven estate had already been noticed by someone far more important than the young noblewoman who mocked him in the kitchen corridor. High above the servant quarters, in a chamber that few in the household were ever permitted to enter, the Queen Mother sat in silence, her attention drawn toward the lower halls of her own estate for the first time in many years. She had felt something the moment the wounded soldier crossed onto Draven land, a presence beneath his ordinary appearance that stirred memories she had long since buried. She said nothing to anyone that day. She simply watched, and waited, and let her daughter's careless words about kitchens and servants pass unchallenged, for now. Over the following days, Ethan settled into the rhythm of the household. He rose early, worked hard, spoke little, and never once complained about the tasks given to him, no matter how far beneath his former rank they might have seemed to anyone watching. The kitchen staff grew to respect him, first for his work ethic, then for the quiet steadiness he brought to a household often tense with the moods of its noble family. Even Lily, who had been wary of him at first, found herself seeking him out during breaks, drawn to his easy patience and the rare moments when a dry, Understated humor slipped through his otherwise guarded demeanor. Serafina, for her part, found reasons to pass through the kitchen more often than she used to, always with some excuse ready if anyone asked. She told herself it was simply curiosity, the natural interest one might have in an unusual guest. She told herself his continued presence in her household was an inconvenience worth monitoring. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that something about his unshaken composure had lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. Each encounter between them followed a similar pattern. She would arrive with some sharp comment, testing for a crack in his patience. He would answer calmly, never rising to her provocations, never once breaking beneath the weight of her scorn. And each time she left more unsettled than before, though she could not have said exactly why. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that her mother had already begun quietly gathering information about the soldier who had collapsed at their gate. The Queen Mother had sent a trusted advisor to examine the nature of the wound that had brought him to their door, a wound that, according to the healers, should have ended his life within minutes, rather than allowing him to walk through an entire kingdom to reach their gates. She had also sent word to old contacts, people who remembered debts and bloodlines stretching back generations, people who might know something about a human family name that had crossed her attention once before, long ago, under circumstances she had never fully explained to anyone in her household. None of this reached Serafina. She remained certain that Ethan Cole was exactly what he appeared to be, an ordinary soldier who had stumbled onto extraordinary luck. She continued to treat him with the casual disdain she reserved for anyone she considered beneath her attention, unaware that the ground beneath her certainty was already beginning to shift, quietly, deliberately, in the shadowed halls above the kitchen where her mother watched and waited, and prepared to reveal a truth that would change everything. On the 6th evening since his arrival, as Ethan finished his duties and made his way back toward the servant quarters beneath a sky heavy with stars, a figure stepped out from the shadows near the garden wall, blocking his path without a word. It was not Serafina. It was someone he had not yet met, someone whose presence carried a weight he felt before he even saw her face clearly in the moonlight. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. "You've caused quite a stir in my household, soldier," the woman said, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that made every instinct in Ethan's body come alert. "I think it's time we spoke." Ethan did not know it yet, but he was standing face to face with the Queen Mother herself, and the conversation about to unfold beneath the stars would set in motion events that neither he nor Serafina could have imagined. The Queen Mother's name, spoken rarely and always with care, was Eleanor Draven, though most in the household simply called her Lady Eleanor, when they dared speak of her at all. She rarely left her private chambers, and even more rarely walked the grounds after dark, which made her sudden appearance before Ethan all the more unsettling. He straightened his posture instinctively, the old habits of military discipline rising to the surface, even though he wore a servant's clothes, rather than a uniform. "My lady," Ethan said carefully, unsure how much respect the situation demanded, but choosing to err on the side of caution. "I wasn't told you wished to see me." "That's because I didn't tell anyone," Eleanor replied, stepping closer, her eyes studying him, with an intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of a physician examining a wound. "I prefer to make my own observations before involving the rest of the household in my business." She circled him slowly, the way her daughter had done days earlier, but where Serafina's inspection had felt like scorn dressed up as curiosity, Eleanor's felt like something closer to recognition. She stopped in front of him again, and studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me about the wound that brought you here," she said. "Not what the healers told you, what you remember." Ethan hesitated. He had barely spoken of the ambush to anyone since it happened, partly because the details were hazy, and partly because what he did remember made little sense. "We were moving through the Eastern Pass when we were attacked. It happened fast. I remember flashes of steel, and then something struck my shoulder. I should have died there with the rest of my unit. I don't know how I didn't. The healers who treated you noted something unusual about the wound," Eleanor said. "A pattern that shouldn't exist from any blade forged by human hands. Did you notice anything strange about your attackers?" Ethan frowned, trying to recall details lost in the chaos of that night. "They moved differently, faster than anything I'd trained against." I thought it was adrenaline playing tricks on my mind. But now that you mention it, one of them said something before striking me. I didn't understand the words. Eleanor's expression shifted, something flickering behind her eyes, that Ethan couldn't quite name, though it looked almost like recognition mixed with old grief. Do you remember the sound of the words, even if you didn't understand their meaning? Ethan repeated the fragmented syllables as best he could, unsure why it mattered so much to her. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as though the sound confirmed something she had already suspected, but hoped would not be true. When she opened them again, her voice had softened, though the weight behind it remained heavy. Soldier, what do you know of your family, beyond your parents and grandparents? Not much, Ethan admitted. My mother died when I was young. My father raised me alone, and he never spoke much about where our family came from before settling in the eastern provinces. He said it wasn't important, that we were simply soldiers and farmers, nothing more. And did your father ever mention a name? Cole is a common enough surname, but the line it descends from carries a history longer than you might realize. Ethan shook his head slowly, unease building in his chest. He never mentioned anything like that. What are you saying, my lady? Eleanor studied him for a long moment before answering, choosing her words with obvious care. I am saying that the family who attacked your unit did not do so by accident, and I do not believe your survival was luck, no matter how it might feel to you. There are old debts in this world, soldier, older than kingdoms, and some of them have a way of finding the descendants meant to settle them, whether those descendants know anything about the debt or not. I don't understand, Ethan said, and for the first time since his arrival at the estate, genuine confusion cracked through his composed exterior. Not yet, Eleanor agreed, and I won't pretend to have all the answers myself, but I intend to find them, and until I do, I want you to remain here, under this roof, where I can keep watch over you properly, not as a servant, not as someone to be hidden away in the kitchens. Something in her tone carried an authority that made it clear this was not a request. Ethan nodded slowly, though the questions multiplying in his mind made sleep, when he finally returned to his small room that night, difficult to find. The following morning, Eleanor summoned her daughter to her private study, a room Seraphina rarely entered, since her mother's meetings there usually concerned matters of state or old family business that held little interest for her. She arrived expecting some dry conversation about upcoming diplomatic visits or estate finances. She did not expect the subject to be Ethan Cole.
You've been unkind to the soldier, Eleanor said without preamble. Seated behind a heavy wooden desk, covered in old letters and documents Seraphina had never seen before.
Seraphina blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the accusation. He's a human who wandered onto our land. I gave him shelter and work. That's more generosity than most nobles would offer. Generosity, Eleanor repeated, her tone carrying an edge of dry disappointment. Is that what you call mocking a wounded man in front of your household staff? I hardly mocked him, Seraphina said, though even as she spoke, she found herself recalling several exchanges that might not hold up well under closer scrutiny. I simply reminded him of his place. That's not cruelty, Mother. That's how things work in this house, and every house like ours. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked slowly to the window overlooking the gardens, her expression thoughtful and distant. I want you to pay closer attention to him, Seraphina. Not with scorn, with honest observation. There is more to that soldier than either of us understood when he first arrived at our gate. More how? Seraphina asked, curiosity beginning to override her irritation. Mother, what aren't you telling me? I'm not certain enough yet to tell you anything with confidence, Eleanor admitted, but I suspect his bloodline carries a history, tied to an old debt owed by families far older and more powerful than either of us. I intend to investigate further before I say more, and I expect you to treat him with the caution and respect that possibility deserves, regardless of what you believe you already know about him. Seraphina left her mother's study more unsettled than she cared to admit, turning the conversation over in her mind as she walked the halls toward her own chambers. She told herself that her mother was likely overreacting, seeing significance in coincidence, the way older generations sometimes did when faced with anything unusual. But a small, uncomfortable seed of doubt had been planted, and try as she might, she could not fully dismiss it. Over the following days, She found herself watching Ethan with new eyes, no longer simply looking for reasons to mock him, but genuinely observing the way he carried himself, the discipline in even his smallest movements, the calm authority that seemed to radiate from him despite his lowered position in the household. She began to notice things she had previously overlooked, the way other servants deferred to him naturally, seeking his guidance on matters unrelated to kitchen work, the way he handled conflict among the staff, with a fairness that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the way a good commander might handle disputes among troops. The way his eyes carried a weight of experience that seemed far too old for a man of his years. One afternoon, she found him alone near the estate's training yard, an area typically reserved for the household guard, watching two young guards spar with wooden practice swords, their technique clumsy and undisciplined. He said nothing, simply observed with the quiet focus of someone evaluating a problem he had not been asked to solve. "You're staring at my guards like you have opinions about their training," Serafina said, approaching from behind, her tone carrying less bite than it usually did. Ethan turned, unsurprised by her presence, as though he had sensed her approach before she spoke. "Their footwork is poor. They're overcommitting on every strike, leaving themselves open. It's not their fault. Whoever trained them clearly focused more on strength than precision." Serafina crossed her arms, studying him with fresh curiosity, rather than her usual dismissiveness. "And you would know better, I suppose. I trained soldiers for 6 years before joining the front lines myself," Ethan said simply, without a trace of boasting in his voice. "It's not arrogance. It's just fact." For a moment, Serafina said nothing, watching the guards continue their clumsy exchange, seeing now, through Ethan's brief assessment, flaws in their technique she had never noticed before, despite having watched them train dozens of times. "Why didn't you offer to help them?" she finally asked. "Because no one asked me to," Ethan replied, "and because I doubt anyone in this household would welcome a human offering lessons to Draven guards, however useful those lessons might be." The honesty of his answer, delivered without bitterness, struck her harder than she expected. She found herself, against every instinct that told her not to, considering his words seriously, rather than dismissing them outright. "Show me," she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as him. "If you're truly as capable as you claim, prove it. Correct their form." Ethan studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for mockery, and finding, to his mild surprise, genuine curiosity instead. He nodded once and stepped forward into the training yard, calling a brief pause to the sparring guards. What followed over the next half hour left Serafina standing at the edge of the yard in quiet astonishment. Ethan moved through basic corrections, with an ease and clarity that transformed the guards' clumsy exchanges into something resembling genuine skill within a remarkably short time. He spoke little, demonstrated much, and adjusted his teaching to each guard's individual weaknesses, with an instinct that clearly came from years of hard-earned experience. By the end of the session, both guards were sparring with noticeably improved technique, and one of them, breathless and grinning, turned to Serafina with obvious enthusiasm. "My lady, he's better than any trainer we've had. Could he stay on to teach us properly?" Serafina glanced toward Ethan, who said nothing, simply waiting to see how she would respond, his expression carefully neutral despite the guard's praise. She felt something shift inside her chest, an uncomfortable mixture of reluctant respect and lingering pride that refused to let her admit, out loud, just how impressed she truly was. "We'll see," she said finally, turning to leave before her expression could betray more than her words already had. That night, alone in her chambers, Serafina found herself unable to stop replaying the afternoon's events. The image of Ethan moving through the training yard with quiet mastery lingered in her mind alongside her mother's cryptic warning about old debts and hidden bloodlines. For the first time since his arrival, she allowed herself to wonder, seriously, whether the soldier she had dismissed so easily might be far more than the ordinary human she had assumed him to be. Meanwhile, in her private study, Eleanor Draven sat awake long past midnight, surrounded by old letters and family records stretching back generations, searching for confirmation of a suspicion she had carried since the moment Ethan Cole collapsed at her gate. When she finally found the passage she had been searching for, buried within records so old the ink had nearly faded beyond legibility, Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words confirming everything she had feared and hoped in equal measure. The name Cole appeared exactly where she had suspected it might, tied to an ancient agreement between her own bloodline and a human family whose descendants had long since scattered and forgotten their connection to the Draven name. An agreement that had never been fully honored. A debt that had waited, patiently, for generations, for the right descendant to walk unknowingly back into the lives of the family who owed him far more than mere shelter and kitchen work. Eleanor closed the ancient ledger slowly, her expression a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew now what she had to do, though she also knew the revelation would upend everything her daughter believed about their household, their guest, and the world they thought they understood. She rose from her desk as dawn began to break over the estate, already composing in her mind the words she would need to speak before the entire court. Words that would change Ethan Cole's fate, and Seraphina's understanding of him, forever. 3 days passed before Eleanor summoned Ethan to her study again, and in that time, the household seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something significant was building beneath the surface of ordinary routine. Even if no one could name exactly what it was, Seraphina noticed the shift most of all. Her mother had grown quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in her study poring over documents she refused to discuss with anyone, including her own daughter. When the summons finally came, it arrived not just for Ethan, but for Seraphina as well, delivered by a steward whose expression suggested he knew more than he was permitted to say. Seraphina made her way to her mother's study with a growing sense of unease, arriving to find Ethan already there, standing near the window, his posture composed, but his eyes carrying the same unresolved questions that had followed him since his conversation with Eleanor, beneath the stars nearly 2 weeks earlier. "Sit, both of you," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the chairs positioned before her desk, though her tone made it clear this was not a casual conversation. Once they had settled, she remained standing, pacing slowly before the window, her hands clasped behind her back in a manner that reminded Seraphina of her mother's rare moments of genuine uncertainty. "I've spent the better part of 2 weeks confirming something I first suspected the night this soldier collapsed at our gate," Eleanor began, her voice measured and careful. "What I've found changes a great deal, and I think it's time both of you understood the truth, rather than continuing to stumble through assumptions." Seraphina glanced toward Ethan, who remained silent, watching Eleanor with the patient attentiveness of a man who had already been given fragments of this story and was now waiting for the whole of it. "Centuries ago," Eleanor continued, "long before either of you were born, our family entered into an agreement with a human family whose name has since faded from most records, save for a few carefully preserved documents that I have spent the last several days verifying beyond doubt. That family's name was Cole." The room fell silent. Seraphina felt something cold settle in her stomach as she processed the implication of her mother's words, glancing again toward Ethan, whose expression had shifted from patient curiosity to something closer to quiet shock. "The agreement was made during a time of great conflict between our kind and humankind," Eleanor went on, "a conflict that nearly destroyed both sides before it ended. The Cole family, at great personal cost, intervened on behalf of our bloodline, during a moment when our survival hung by the thinnest of threads. Without their intervention, without the sacrifice made by the head of that family at the time, our line would not exist today. In exchange for that sacrifice, my ancestor made a promise. A debt was declared, to be honored by our family toward any descendant of the Cole line, whoever came before us in need." "What kind of debt?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice carrying a tension he could not fully mask. "A debt of protection, honor, and standing," Eleanor said. "Any descendant of the Cole family who arrives at our door, wounded or in need, is to be treated not as a servant, not as a guest of mere convenience, but as a member of noble standing within this house, entitled to the same protection and respect afforded to any Draven by blood. That promise was made and sealed with old magic that neither time nor forgetfulness could erase, which is precisely why I felt your presence the moment you crossed onto our land, soldier, even before I understood why." Seraphina sat frozen, the weight of her mother's words slowly settling over her like a physical pressure. Every memory of her treatment toward Ethan over the past weeks rose unbidden in her mind, each cutting remark, each dismissive glance, each casual cruelty delivered without a second thought. She had mocked a man whose ancestor had, by her mother's account, saved their entire bloodline from destruction. "Why wasn't this honored generations ago?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, despite the obvious weight of the revelation. "If this debt has existed for centuries, why did no one from your family seek out my ancestors to make things right?" Eleanor's expression turned somber. "Because the Cole family scattered and disappeared not long after the agreement was made, fleeing further conflict that erupted shortly afterward. My own ancestors searched for them for a time, but the trail went cold, and over generations, the search was abandoned, the debt recorded but never resolved. I do not offer that as an excuse, only as an explanation. The failure to honor this debt sooner rests upon my own family's shoulders, not yours." Ethan absorbed this in silence, his mind working through the implications of everything he had just learned. He had arrived at this estate believing himself nothing more than a wounded soldier seeking temporary shelter. He was now being told that he was, by ancient agreement and old magic, owed a place of honor within one of the most powerful households in the realm. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Now," Eleanor said, turning to face both of them fully, "I intend to honor the debt my family has carried for far too long. Tomorrow, during the scheduled gathering of the court, I will make a formal declaration before every noble present. I will not simply grant you a title in private. I will ensure the entire household, and every visiting noble family who witnesses the ceremony, understands exactly who you are, and the honor owed to you." Serafina finally found her voice, though it emerged smaller and less certain than she was used to. "Mother, what exactly are you planning to do?" Eleanor's gaze settled on her daughter, not unkindly, but with the firm clarity of someone who had already made a difficult decision and would not be swayed from it. "Tomorrow, before the full court, I will command every noble present, including you, to bow before Ethan Cole, in recognition of the debt owed to his bloodline and the sacrifice made by his ancestor on our family's behalf. It is the very least this house can offer, after generations of neglecting a promise that should have been honored long ago." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Serafina's mind reeled, images of her own behavior toward Ethan flooding back with fresh and uncomfortable clarity. She had spent weeks treating him as beneath her notice, mocking his presence, reminding him constantly of a status she now understood to be entirely false. Tomorrow, she would be expected to kneel before him in front of the entire court, an act that would strip away every ounce of superiority she had clung to since his arrival. Ethan, for his part, seemed equally overwhelmed, though his composure held steady even as the magnitude of the announcement settled over him. "My lady, I never asked for any of this. I came here seeking nothing more than shelter." "I know," Eleanor said gently, "and that, more than anything else, confirms what my instincts told me the moment you arrived. A man seeking only shelter, who never once used his circumstances to demand more than he was given, is precisely the kind of man deserving of the honor my family has owed his bloodline for centuries. This is not a burden I am placing upon you, soldier. It is a debt I am finally settling." The remainder of that day passed in a strange, suspended tension throughout the household. Word of the impending court gathering spread quickly among the staff, though the specific reason for Eleanor's declaration remained known only to the 3 people who had been present in her study. Serafina retreated to her chambers earlier than usual that evening, sitting alone by her window, watching the last light fade from the sky, as she wrestled with emotions she had rarely allowed herself to feel. Pride warred with shame inside her. Pride, because everything she had believed about her family's standing, her own position within the world, felt suddenly less secure than she had assumed. Shame, because she could not deny the truth of her own behavior toward a man who, by any measure that mattered to her family's honor, deserved far better treatment than she had given him. She thought of every sharp comment, every dismissive glance, every moment she had used her position to remind him of a status that had never truly applied to him at all. Unable to sit with her thoughts any longer, she left her chambers and made her way toward the kitchen corridor, half expecting to find it empty at this late hour. Instead, she found Ethan seated near the servants' dining table, alone, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, his expression distant and unreadable. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The easy dynamic of mockery and quiet defiance that had defined their previous conversations felt suddenly impossible to return to, replaced by something far more uncertain. "I owe you an apology," Serafina said finally, the words feeling foreign and difficult in her mouth. "For everything I've said to you since you arrived." Ethan studied her for a long moment before responding, his expression carefully neutral. "You didn't know." "That's not an excuse," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own words. "I was cruel to you because I believed you were beneath me, and I never once considered that I might be wrong. That's not something ignorance excuses. It's something it explains, and poorly." Ethan allowed a small, tired smile to cross his face, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him since his arrival. "For what it's worth, I never expected an apology. I've dealt with worse than sharp words, Serafina. What troubles me more is tomorrow, and what your mother intends to do." "You're worried about the ceremony," she said, sitting down across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I never wanted to be someone others are forced to kneel before," Ethan admitted. "I spent years training soldiers, fighting alongside them as equals, not above them. This feels like it's turning me into something I never asked to become." Serafina considered his words carefully, seeing in them a reflection of the same quiet dignity that had first unsettled her weeks earlier. "Maybe that's exactly why my mother believes you deserve it, because you never sought power for yourself. You never once used anything that happened here to your own advantage." Ethan met her eyes, and for a long moment, something passed between them that neither fully understood yet. An acknowledgement that whatever the following day held, they were both walking into unfamiliar territory together, their previous roles as noblewoman and lowly soldier no longer holding the certainty either of them had once relied upon. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Ethan said quietly, "I'd rather face it, knowing I haven't lost the small amount of respect I've managed to earn here through honest work, rather than gaining a title I never asked for." "You've earned far more than a small amount of respect," Serafina said, and this time, there was no bite in her words, no lingering scorn, only quiet, unguarded honesty. "I think everyone in this household knew that before I did." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of the coming day settling over both of them differently than it had that afternoon. When Serafina finally rose to return to her chambers, she paused at the doorway, looking back at him one last time. "Whatever my mother decides tomorrow," she said, "know that you've already earned my respect, title or no title. That should have come long before now, and I'm sorry it didn't." Ethan nodded, watching her leave, and for the first time since he had collapsed at the Draven Gates weeks earlier, he allowed himself to feel something other than cautious wariness about his place within this household. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever ancient debt and old magic had set into motion, he found himself, unexpectedly, no longer entirely alone in facing it. Elsewhere in the estate, Eleanor Draven remained awake late into the night, finalizing the words she would speak before the court, aware that tomorrow's declaration would not simply honor an old debt, but would reshape the household's understanding of honor, worth, and the dangerous assumptions that came from judging someone by appearance alone. She had waited generations to right a wrong her own bloodline had allowed to persist. Tomorrow, finally, she intended to make it right, regardless of how deeply it would shake the comfortable certainties of everyone who called her household home. The great hall of the Draven estate had not seen a gathering of this size in years. Nobles from neighboring territories arrived throughout the morning, filling the courtyard with carriages bearing family crests that stretched back generations, their occupants dressed in fine silks and polished armor, befitting the formality of a scheduled court gathering. None of them knew the true purpose behind Eleanor's summons, only that the reclusive Queen Mother had requested their presence for a declaration she described as being of the utmost importance to the honor of her household. Ethan stood in a small antechamber adjoining the great hall, dressed not in the servant's clothes he had worn for weeks, but in a formal garment provided that morning by Eleanor's own household tailor, dark fabric trimmed with understated silver thread, simple, but unmistakably befitting someone of noble consideration. He studied his reflection in a nearby mirror, barely recognizing himself, the weight of the coming moment settling heavily across his shoulders. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Serafina entered, dressed in formal court attire herself, her expression carrying none of the cool detachment she usually wore in public settings. She studied him for a moment, taking in the transformation, before speaking. "You look like you're facing an execution rather than an honor," she said, a faint attempt at levity that didn't quite land given the tension in her voice. "It feels similar," Ethan admitted, turning to face her fully. "I've stood before enemy lines with less unease than I feel right now." "For what it's worth," Serafina said, stepping closer. "You don't have to face it as a stranger in this house. Whatever happens out there, you've made allies here, myself included, whether either of us expected that a month ago or not." Ethan offered her a small, grateful nod, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at her words. Before either of them could say more, a steward appeared at the door, announcing that the court was assembled and Eleanor was ready to begin. The great hall stretched before them as they entered, rows of nobles standing along either side of a long carpet leading toward a raised platform where Eleanor waited, dressed in formal robes that marked her authority as head of the Draven household. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as Ethan walked the length of the hall alongside Serafina, many of the nobles recognizing him only vaguely as the human soldier who had been given shelter weeks earlier, uncertain why his presence warranted such formal attention. Ethan took his place before the platform, Serafina standing slightly behind and to his side, while Eleanor surveyed the assembled court with the calm authority of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect without needing to raise her voice. "Thank you all for answering my summons," Eleanor began, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "I have called you here today to address a matter of great importance to the honor of this household, one that has remained unresolved for far longer than it should have." She gestured toward Ethan, drawing every eye in the room toward him. Whispers spread through the crowd, curiosity mixing with confusion, as nobles tried to understand the significance of a human soldier standing at the center of such a formal gathering. "Weeks ago," Eleanor continued, "this man arrived at our gate, wounded, and seeking nothing more than shelter. Many of you, had you been present, might have turned him away, or treated him as little more than a servant, as my own household initially did, myself included, in the earliest days of his arrival." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs passed through the assembled nobles, several exchanging uncertain glances, sensing that whatever Eleanor was building toward carried significant weight. "What none of us understood at the time," Eleanor went on, "was that this man, Ethan Cole, descends from a bloodline that once saved this very household from complete destruction. Centuries ago, during a conflict that nearly ended our family's existence, an ancestor of his intervened at great personal cost, sacrificing everything to ensure our survival. In exchange, my own ancestor made a solemn promise, sealed with old magic that has waited, patiently, for generations, for a descendant of that bloodline to walk through our gates once more." The hall fell into stunned silence. Every eye turned toward Ethan, whose composed expression betrayed little of the discomfort he felt beneath the weight of so much sudden attention. "That promise," Eleanor said, her voice growing firmer, carrying the unmistakable authority of a formal declaration, "was that any descendant of the Cole bloodline, whoever arrived at this household in need, would be treated not as a servant, not as a guest of passing convenience, but with the full honor and respect owed to nobility within our own ranks. For generations this debt went unresolved, unknown even to my own household. Today, I intend to correct that failure." Eleanor stepped down from the platform, moving to stand directly before Ethan, her expression solemn and resolute. "Ethan Cole, on behalf of the Draven household, I formally recognize the debt owed to your bloodline, and I extend to you the full honor promised by my ancestors centuries ago. From this day forward, you stand not as a servant within these walls, but as a man deserving of the same respect afforded to any member of noble standing in this realm." She turned then to face the assembled court, her voice rising with unmistakable command. "As head of this household, I ask every noble present, and every member of my own family, to show this man the honor, centuries overdue. I ask you all to bow before Ethan Cole, in recognition of the sacrifice his bloodline made on behalf of ours, and in acknowledgement of the debt this house has finally chosen to honor." For a moment, no one moved, the shock of the declaration settling over the hall like a physical weight. Then, slowly, one by one, the assembled nobles began to lower themselves into formal bows, murmurs of astonishment, giving way to solemn acknowledgement, as the full significance of Eleanor's words settled over them. Guards who had once looked at Ethan with casual dismissal now bent low with genuine respect. Nobles who had never spared him a second glance inclined their heads in formal acknowledgement. Serafina, standing beside her mother, felt the weight of the moment more deeply than perhaps anyone else in the hall. She thought of every dismissive word she had spoken to Ethan. Every moment she had reminded him of a status that had never truly applied to him, and now, standing before the entire court, she understood there was only one way to properly close that chapter of her own behavior. Without hesitation, without the reluctance that might have gripped her weeks earlier, she lowered herself into a deep, formal bow before him, her expression carrying none of her earlier scorn, only genuine respect. Ethan stood at the center of the great hall, surrounded by an entire court bowing before him, and felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions he struggled to fully process. Pride, at the recognition finally given to his family's sacrifice, generations after the fact. Discomfort, at the sheer scale of attention now focused upon him, and beneath both, a quiet, steady gratitude toward the woman who had chosen honesty and honor over the comfortable silence that could have easily continued indefinitely. When the formal bows finally rose, Eleanor turned back toward Ethan, her expression softening slightly from the solemn authority she had carried throughout the declaration. "This household owes you more than words can fully express, soldier. From this day forward, you will have a place here, not as a guest dependent on our charity, but as someone this family is honored to call an ally, and if you're willing, something closer to family." Ethan bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement, finding his voice steadier than he expected given the circumstances. "I never sought this honor, my lady, but I accept it with gratitude, and I hope to prove myself worthy of the trust your family has placed in me, not through titles or ceremony, but through the same work and dedication I've shown since the day I arrived." A murmur of approval passed through the assembled nobles at his words, several exchanging impressed glances at the humility carried within his response, a stark contrast to the arrogance many might have expected from someone suddenly elevated to such unexpected standing. Eleanor allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, sensing that her instincts about this soldier had been correct from the very beginning. As the formal proceedings drew to a close, and the assembled nobles began mingling throughout the hall, discussing the unprecedented events they had just witnessed, Serafina found her way back to Ethan's side, her earlier discomfort giving way to something warmer, more genuine. "I believe I owe you a proper introduction," she said, extending her hand toward him with a small, sincere smile. "Lady Serafina Draven, it's an honor to finally know you properly." Ethan accepted her hand, a genuine smile breaking through his composed exterior for the first time since entering the hall. "Ethan Cole. Though I believe we're already well acquainted, my lady. However unconventional our introduction might have been, unconventional is one word for it," Serafina replied, a soft laugh escaping her despite the formality of their surroundings. "Though I'd like to think our next conversations will carry less mockery on my part." "I'd like that too," Ethan admitted, and for a moment, standing amid the buzzing conversation of the assembled court, the two of them shared a quiet understanding that transcended the dramatic revelations of the day, an acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would face it with a foundation of mutual respect that had been hard-won, but genuine. As the celebration continued late into the evening, word of the day's events spread quickly beyond the estate's walls, carried by the visiting nobles back to their own territories, ensuring that Ethan Cole's name, and the story of the debt finally honored by the Draven household, would not remain confined to a single court gathering. It marked, for Ethan, the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one he had never anticipated when he collapsed, wounded and desperate, at the gates of a household he had once believed offered him nothing but temporary shelter. But even as the celebration wound down and the last of the visiting nobles departed, Eleanor remained troubled by one lingering concern she had not yet voiced to either Ethan or her daughter. The attackers who had ambushed Ethan's unit, the ones who had spoken words in a language that confirmed her suspicions about his heritage, had not acted randomly. Someone, somewhere, had known about the ancient debt owed to the Cole bloodline, and had attempted to eliminate its last descendant before that debt could ever be honored, which meant that whoever orchestrated the attack on Ethan's unit was unlikely to simply accept the outcome of today's declaration without further attempts to undo it. In the weeks following the formal declaration, Life within the Draven estate settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm. Ethan no longer worked among the kitchen staff, though he insisted on maintaining some of his old routines, unwilling to abandon entirely the simple, grounded work that had helped him process the chaos of his arrival. Instead, he split his time between overseeing improvements to the household guard's training, a role Seraphina had personally requested Eleanor grant him, and slowly adjusting to the strange new reality of his elevated standing within the household. Seraphina found herself spending increasing amounts of time in his company, drawn initially by genuine curiosity about the man she had so thoroughly misjudged, and later by something warmer and less easily categorized. Their conversations, once defined by her sharp mockery and his quiet endurance, had transformed into something closer to easy companionship, filled with genuine curiosity about each other's lives, backgrounds, and the vastly different worlds they had each grown up within. One afternoon, as autumn began settling over the estate grounds, coloring the surrounding trees in shades of gold and amber, Seraphina found Ethan in the training yard, this time not observing from a distance, but actively working through combat forms, alongside the guards he had spent weeks training. She watched from the edge of the yard, admiring the fluid precision of his movements, the quiet confidence that seemed to have settled more fully into him since the formal declaration had lifted the weight of uncertain status from his shoulders. When the training session ended, Ethan noticed her watching, and made his way over, a light sheen of exertion visible despite the cool autumn air. "Come to inspect my work again?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "Something like that," Seraphina replied, matching his tone easily, "though I confess my reasons for visiting the training yard lately have less to do with inspection and more to do with company." Ethan studied her for a moment, something warm passing behind his eyes. "I'll admit, I've grown rather fond of your company myself, unconventional as our beginning might have been." They walked together through the estate gardens as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, their conversation drifting easily between lighter topics and deeper reflections on everything that had changed since Ethan's arrival. It was during one such quiet moment, as they paused beside a small fountain at the garden's center, that Ethan's expression grew more serious, the ease of their earlier conversation giving way to something heavier. "Your mother mentioned a concern to me yesterday," he said carefully, "about the attackers who ambushed my unit. She believes they knew about the old debt, and that whoever sent them is unlikely to simply accept what happened here without further action." Seraphina's expression sobered immediately, the warmth of the afternoon giving way to genuine concern. "She mentioned the same to me. I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily, but if she's right, this isn't over yet, not entirely." "I've suspected as much myself," Ethan admitted. "The attack felt too deliberate, too precise, to have been simple bad luck. Whoever orchestrated it knew exactly who I was, or at least suspected it, long before I understood any of this myself." A comfortable silence fell between them, as they both considered the implications. The peaceful autumn afternoon suddenly carrying an undercurrent of unresolved tension neither of them could fully ignore. Seraphina reached out, resting her hand gently on his arm, a gesture that surprised them both with its easy familiarity. "Whatever comes next," she said quietly, "you won't face it alone this time. This household, myself included, owes you far more than simple recognition. We owe you protection, and I intend to make certain that debt is honored just as fully as the first." Ethan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them, a quiet acknowledgement of how far their relationship had traveled since that first tense encounter at the estate gates. "I appreciate that more than you know. Though, I'd like to think, by now, I'm not simply someone this household owes a debt to. I'd like to think we've built something beyond obligation." "We have," Seraphina agreed softly. "Whatever debt brought you here in the first place, everything since has been built on something far more genuine than old promises and ancient magic." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a household guard, breathless from having run across the estate grounds, carrying urgent news that immediately shattered the quiet intimacy of the moment. A group of unfamiliar riders had been spotted approaching the estate's outer boundary, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested military training rather than casual travel. Eleanor had already been informed and was assembling the household guard in response. Ethan's demeanor shifted instantly. years of military instinct taking over as he moved into action, Serafina following close behind as they made their way toward the estate's main gates. They found Eleanor already positioned near the entrance, her expression grave, as she studied the approaching riders through the gathering dusk. "How many?" Ethan asked, falling into step beside her, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to assessing threats. "A dozen, perhaps more," Eleanor replied, moving with clear intent, not the casual pace of travelers or diplomats. "I believe our earlier concerns were justified." The household guard, thanks to weeks of training under Ethan's guidance, assembled with far greater discipline and speed than they would have managed a month earlier, forming a defensive line before the estate's gates under Eleanor's watchful direction. Ethan positioned himself near the front, his earlier uncertainty about his place within the household entirely absent now, replaced by the focused clarity of a man doing exactly what years of training had prepared him for. As the approaching riders drew close enough to be seen clearly in the fading light, their leader raised a hand, signaling the group to halt a respectful distance from the estate's gates. He was human, dressed in traveling clothes that bore no obvious military markings, though something about his bearing suggested formal training similar to Ethan's own background. "I mean no harm to this household," the rider called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "I've come seeking Ethan Cole, on a matter of great urgency concerning his surviving family." Ethan's composure faltered slightly at the mention of family he had believed long lost, or non-existent beyond his deceased parents. Eleanor glanced toward him, sensing his sudden uncertainty, before addressing the rider herself. "State your business clearly, or this conversation ends here," she called back, her tone carrying no room for evasion. The rider dismounted slowly, approaching with his hands visibly empty, a gesture of peaceful intent that eased some of the tension rippling through the assembled guards. "My name is Gareth Holloway. I served alongside Ethan's father years ago, before circumstances forced our paths apart. I've spent months searching for any surviving members of the Cole bloodline, following rumors of an old debt owed to that family by powers far greater than ordinary kingdoms." Ethan stepped forward, studying the man carefully, searching for any hint of familiarity in his features or bearing. "You knew my father?" "I did," Gareth confirmed, his expression softening slightly. He spoke often of a legacy he believed his family carried, though he never fully understood its nature himself. "When word reached me of an ambush, matching the pattern of attacks targeting descendants of old bloodlines, I feared the worst, and came as quickly as I could, hoping to offer what protection and information I could provide." Eleanor studied the newcomer carefully before finally nodding, signaling the guards to lower their weapons. "Come inside. If what you say is true, we have much to discuss, and I suspect the information you carry may prove essential to understanding exactly who orchestrated the attack on Ethan's unit, and why." As Gareth was escorted into the estate, Ethan remained near the gates for a moment longer, processing this unexpected development, Serafina moving to stand quietly beside him, offering silent support without needing to speak. "Family you never knew you had," she said softly. "This day continues to surprise you, doesn't it?" "More than I ever expected when I first collapsed at these gates," Ethan admitted, a faint, wondering smile crossing his face, despite the seriousness of the situation. "I came here believing myself entirely alone in the world. I'm beginning to think that was never quite true." Inside the estate's great hall, Gareth shared what he knew over the following hours, revealing details about the Cole family's forgotten history that even Eleanor's careful research had not uncovered. There were others, it seemed, distant relatives scattered across the realm, unaware of their own connection to a bloodline carrying both ancient honor and, apparently, ancient enemies, determined to prevent that honor from ever being properly recognized. The attack on Ethan's unit had not been random, Gareth confirmed, but rather the latest in a series of deliberate efforts spanning years, aimed at eliminating any descendant of the Cole line before old debts like the one Eleanor had honored could ever be fulfilled. The revelation settled heavily over the assembled household, transforming what had begun as a personal, intimate story of misjudgment and redemption between Ethan and Serafina into something with far broader implications. Powerful forces, it seemed, had been working for years to ensure debts like the one Eleanor had just honored remained forever unresolved, and Ethan's survival, and the subsequent public declaration recognizing his family's sacrifice, had likely placed him squarely in the path of enemies who would not simply accept defeat quietly. Later that night, as the household finally settled into uneasy rest following the day's overwhelming revelations, Ethan found himself once again standing near the estate's garden fountain, the same spot where he and Serafina had shared their quiet conversation hours earlier, though the peaceful atmosphere of that afternoon felt distant now, replaced by the weight of new uncertainties. Serafina joined him there, wrapping a warm cloak around her shoulders against the cool night air, settling beside him without a word. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, both processing the magnitude of everything that had unfolded since his arrival weeks earlier. "Whatever comes next," Serafina finally said, breaking the silence, "whatever enemies your family's legacy has made, know that this household stands with you now, fully and without hesitation. My mother made that clear today, and I intend to honor that same commitment personally, for as long as you'll have me beside you." Ethan turned to face her, the moonlight catching the sincerity in her expression, and felt, for the first time since his desperate arrival at these gates, a genuine sense of belonging that had nothing to do with ancient debts or magical promises, and everything to do with the person standing beside him now. "I came here as a stranger, seeking nothing more than shelter," he said quietly. "I never expected to find family, purpose, and something far more meaningful than the honor your mother declared before the entire court today. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I'm grateful, more than words can properly express, that my path led me here, to you, and to this household." Serafina smiled softly, reaching out to take his hand, a simple gesture that carried the full weight of everything they had built together since that first tense, mocking encounter weeks earlier. "Then let's face whatever comes next together, Ethan Cole. Debt honored, family found, and a future neither of us could have predicted when you first collapsed at these gates." Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the clear autumn sky, silent witnesses to a story that had begun with mockery and misunderstanding, and had transformed, through honesty, courage, and the slow unraveling of ancient truths, into something far more powerful than either of them could have imagined. The road ahead remained uncertain, shadowed by enemies neither fully understood yet, and a legacy still being uncovered piece by piece. But for the first time since the chaos that had brought him to the Draven estate, Ethan Cole faced that uncertain future not as a lone soldier fighting for survival, but as a man who had found, against every expectation, a place, a purpose, and a growing bond that promised to carry him through whatever challenges still lay ahead.